Hello, and welcome back to Building Integrity. I'm your host, Josh Porter, and today we're going to be talking about a new Florida condo law that got passed recently during a special session, which was called by the Florida governor a few weeks ago. It's Senate Bill 4D. It was actually put on the table and it was adopted pretty much unanimously. And what it does is it creates some new laws and some new requirements that boards must follow, condo association boards must follow, in order to, really the idea is to prevent the next Champlain Towers South, prevent the next disaster. Reinforced concrete condominiums in human history is a relatively recent concept and development. And they're just now getting into that 50-year-old, 60-year-old, some of these buildings, some of them are 30 and 40 years old, obviously, but they're getting to that age point now where we need to seriously consider how these structures are maintained as a society. And this law sort of tries to put some things on the table to cover that. But before I get into that, I want to cover a really quick and interesting sidebar that also got passed as part of this bill, which was that they eliminated the 25% rule for roof repairs on condominium buildings and for structures, actually. And I'll explain a little bit about that. And so the way it works currently in the Florida Building Code is that if it says that if you have to replace or repair 25% or more of your roof, you have to replace the entire roofing system. Not the structural roof, but the roofing membrane over the roof. And so what was happening was anytime a storm would come by, like a category 2 hurricane or a tropical storm would come by, contractors would come in from out of state, and they are very good at manipulating the insurance system, essentially. And so what they would do is they would come out and they would look at roofs and they would say, oh, we find damage here and we find damage there, and it exceeds 25%. And the insurance companies were required by law, if there was a code provision, if there was a code provision that required you to do more than just what was actually damaged, then the insurance company had to pay. So what was happening was these roofing contractors would come in, they would find that, okay, 25% of the roof is damaged, and they would kind of stretch that truth a little bit, oftentimes. And then the insurance company was basically on the hook to replace the entire roof. So associations didn't mind because they got free roofs, and the contractors didn't mind because they got a lot of work. And at the end of the day, the insurance companies, which overall I don't really have a lot of sympathy for, but they were the ones kind of being stuck with this bill. So they obviously lobbied to get this eliminated. And that's sort of the motivation behind why that has been changed in the new Senate bill. All right, so the Senate bill breaks down into two major categories of things that they're covering. One is these new inspections that associations are required to get, which are called milestone inspections. And then the other thing that the associations are required to get are structural integrity reserve studies. So we're going to quickly go through both of those, and I'm going to explain to you what's in there so that if you live in a condo, or if you're on a condo board, or you're in the industry, or even if you're just like this channel and you like these videos, you can learn a little bit of something about the motivation and some of the structural components of this new law. So the purpose of the milestone inspection, which creates essentially Florida Statute 553.899, the purpose, they state, is to determine the, quote, general structural condition of the building, end quote. Every word is very important when you're talking about law. And the word general is in there to allow the engineer to have some discretion, the engineer or architect to have some discretion. All right, so it says the purpose is to determine the general structural condition of the building and to determine any, quote, necessary maintenance, repair, or replacement of any structural component of the building, end quote. And they even go as far as to say that the purpose is not to determine if the building meets the existing code, because there's going to be tons of buildings that just don't. And it's always been sort of the standard of care here in Florida and in most states and in most countries that you're sort of grandfathered in. Very, very rarely are you retroactively required to bring something up to code that isn't currently up to code, unless it creates some sort of life safety standard or risk to the occupants living there. Okay. The milestone inspection also defines what substantial structural deterioration is. And this term, substantial structural deterioration, is important because it gets used several times throughout this process, and you'll hear me use it in this video. And they define substantial structural deterioration as distress that negatively affects a building's general structural condition and integrity, The term does not include surface imperfections such as cracks, distortion, sagging, deflections, misalignment, signs of leakage, or peeling of finishes, unless the licensed engineer or architect performing the phase 1 or phase 2 inspection determines that such surface imperfections are a sign of substantial structural deterioration. So long story short, substantial structural deterioration is any visible distress that could be negatively affecting the building's general structural condition and integrity. And we see that word general again, general structural integrity and condition and integrity. And that's really important because it has to be recognized that no engineer, no architect is going to be able to do. We don't have X-ray vision. We can't do a completely exhaustive test of every material, of everything. That would literally require dismantling the entire building and testing every square inch. So you can't have this extreme exhaustive knowledge of the condition of any building. So we have to talk about things in general terms, general conformance, general structural condition. All right, so which condo buildings need this milestone inspection process? And it is a phase 1 and phase 2. I don't know if you caught that in that definition previously, but the buildings that are affected are condo buildings that are 3 stories or taller. And any building that is also 30 years old, if it's within, if it's interior to the coast, or 25 years old if it's within 3 miles of the coastline. So if you have a condo building that's within 3 miles of the coastline, you have to have your first milestone inspection report done within 25 years of your building's age. And if you're further inland than that, you can wait until 30 years to have the first report done. Now, once you have your first milestone inspection report done under this new law, you have to have a new one done within every 10 years subsequently, forever. And what this does is this allows condo boards and residents to be aware of the condition of their building at least once a decade and to know what deterioration is occurring and what they need to address in the near future. All right, so if your condo building is already over that initial time period, the 30 years old or 25 years old if you're within the 3 miles of the coast, if you're already that old, starting today, you need to get your first milestone inspection report done. You have until December 31st, 2024. So you have a little under 2.5 years to get that first study done. And I can tell you with 28,000 condominiums in the state of Florida alone, and very few firms like the firm that I own that can do these types of reports, it's a massive amount of workload to get done in 2.5 years. So I would strongly encourage, if you're a condo board, to call an engineer and get on the waiting list. And so that you are in compliance and you have this first milestone inspection report done before December 31st, 2024. All right. So the milestone inspection report, this new law is broken into 2 phases. So there's like a phase 1 report and there's a phase 2 report. The phase 1 report must be completed within 180 days of receiving notification from the local enforcement agency. And so the law creates requirements for the local enforcement agency, which is basically the building official of your town or your city. And what it does is it requires the building official to know how old your building is, know whether you need this milestone inspection report or not, and then send you written notification that they want it. Now, if you get that written notification from the building official, you have 180 days to get this phase 1 report done. So you have about a half a year to get this report done. All right, and what this report includes is a visual inspection by a licensed architect or engineer, and we're going to talk a little bit about that a little later, but a visual inspection by a licensed architect or engineer of habitable and non-habitable areas and major structural components of the building. Now, the goal in this is to provide what I'm going to quote them as saying is a qualitative assessment. This goes back to what I've been talking about this video, general, qualitative. Okay. This is not a quantitative black and white. The world of restoring and maintaining existing structures is not a black and white world. It is a gray world. And so you kind of have to use what we call engineering judgment to make decisions about what things should be repaired, when they should be repaired. And so what the phase 1 report requires is that an architect or engineer provide a qualitative assessment of the structural components of the building and the habitable, non-habitable areas. And that's really important because the habitable, non-habitable areas are going to cover things like the waterproofing on balconies and walkways, the guardrails on lanais, so that, you know, these aren't necessarily considered the primary structural components of the building, but they are things that really only engineers can comment on, and they lend to the life safety performance of the building. So they're very important. Once this report is done, and assuming that there are no signs of what they call no signs of substantial structural deterioration, if there are any signs of substantial structural deterioration, then you have to trigger a phase 2 milestone inspection report. But assuming there isn't any, so assuming we go out there and we look at the building and we don't see any major cracks, spalls, structural damage with the primary structural components of the building, then a phase 2 study is not required. This phase 1 report has to be delivered to the association and the local building official. So that's a new requirement. We've never had to report anything to the building official, really, unless there's an actual project that's under a permit, of course. But as far as any reports that we produce for our clients, we're not required to give them to the building official. Well, that's new. Now we are. Now, assuming any sort of substantial structural deterioration is observed. So let's say we go out there, we look at concrete damage, we look at spalling, we look at cracking in the columns and beams, and it makes us a little, ooh, this is a little questionable. We're not sure what's going on. We need to know more about the structure of the building. Maybe we need to test some materials. Maybe we need to scan for steel and reinforcement in the concrete. And so if there's any sort of concern of substantial structural deterioration, then this will trigger a phase 2 report under this milestone inspection process. The phase 2 report must be performed, if any substantial structural deterioration is identified during phase 1, and it may involve destructive or non-destructive testing at the inspector's discretion. So this is new because because you're required to have the phase 1 done, and if the phase 1 triggers a phase 2, you as an association are actually required to get the phase 2 done. If the engineer says that he needs to have certain testing done, in the past, this has been optional, like it's recommended. I recommend that you have concrete corings done and scanning of the rebar or ground penetrating radar of the foundation, whatever, right? And oftentimes associations can pick and choose whether they do that additional testing or not to learn more about their building. Well, now that's not really an option. If the engineer doing the phase 2 inspection says this needs to be done, then it has to be done. The associations are bound to have this additional work done. It does give, of course, discretion to the inspector, in other words, the engineer, and it says, quote, this may be as extensive or as limited as necessary. So this gives, again, that decision-making power to the engineer, taking it out of the hands of the board, though, which is important and which is good. And just like in phase 1, once the phase 2 milestone inspection report is completed, that report must also be submitted to both the association and the building official. Okay, now I have some problems or concerns with generally how it's constructed, the law, that is. And one of them is that it says that the building official must send out a written notification to the condo association once it reaches its trigger age that requires this milestone inspection report. Well, the problem is like, what if the building official misses it or wasn't given the information to begin with? They don't send out this thing. Is the association still required to comply? I would say yes. I think it's pretty obvious that the association is still required to comply with having the milestone inspection reports, but I don't understand why the law also forces the building official to send notification out to the association. It sort of creates a redundancy, and oftentimes in redundancies, you can say, well, the reason why we didn't comply, Your Honor, is because the building official never sent us out notifications. So I don't really like the way it's worded in that area. The other thing I really don't like about the milestone inspection process is, from what I can tell, I've just reread the law again this morning before recording this video, is that both architects and engineers can do both the phase 1 and phase 2 portions of the milestone inspection report. And this is really problematic in my opinion, because most structural engineers aren't even capable of doing these types of studies. And what I mean by that is that most structural engineers work in new design, new construction, and they have a paradigm of thought that's very different. I did new design for 5.5 years. And in new design, I didn't know anything about waterproofing. I didn't know anything about how to evaluate structural cracks on a building. That's not in the mindset of a design engineer. So you've already got a schism there between engineers, where you have new design engineers and you have existing structural consultants like myself, and so you already have a problem there that all engineers are allowed to do these studies, but then now you allow architects to do these studies as well. I mean, architects have, again, I love architecture. I do photography as a hobby. I love photographing architecture. I'm a big fan of architects and architecture, but they're not qualified to assess whether a building could be collapsing or not. I point right back to Champlain Tower South. You had a structural engineer with a resume showing that he does existing structures consulting, and they missed so much on the Champlain Tower South situation, which cost so many people their lives. So this just shows you that the bar is very high for people who are qualified to really know what they're talking about and know what they're looking at when evaluating an existing structure. So I am not happy that architects are allowed to provide these milestone inspection reports. I think most architects are going to bow out and just not do them anyway, but because this is sort of a cash cow coming in for the industry, there's so much work now coming our way. I can see a lot of people wanting to dip their toes into this and try to reap some of the financial benefits of this new law. Okay, last problem I kind of have with this thing is that the law actually says that once you receive a phase 2 report, and the phase 2 report says that you need to do XYZ structural repairs to your building, that you have 365 days to conduct those repairs. So basically you have 1 year to conduct those repairs. Well, before this law got passed, there's almost no way we can investigate a building, write a report, and then from the day of the report, we can get a contractor to mobilize within a year. The industry itself in Florida is backed up at least a year and a half. So like, for example, I'm recording this video in June of 2022. And if I have a client call our office today wanting to have their building restored, we are bidding out a job to start maybe June of next year. Maybe, if we're lucky. More likely, it's probably going to be starting in October of next year. So that just shows you sort of how delayed these contractors are, because while engineers are sort of a limiting factor for getting these milestone inspection reports done, the contractors are going to be an even bigger limiting factor. And what this is going to create, again, is a problem where you're going to have contractors that are really unqualified trying to shift into this industry. And so this is problematic. So I'm not a big fan of the fact that they only allowed associations to have 365 days to conduct the repairs. I think what should have been done maybe is the language should have been worded to state that you have a certain amount of time to get critical repairs done. And there needs to be like something described or defined as what is a critical repair in the opinion of the engineer of record doing the study. All right, so moving on, that kind of covers all of the milestone inspection reports, these structural reports that need to be done. I've kind of already aired my grievances with parts of it, but in the big picture, I really like this. I'm really glad it exists. I think it's really important moving forward to protect condos, protect residents, and more importantly, protect people who maybe have they're renting in these buildings. And so they're not even owners. They're not partaking in the benefit of ownership. They're just renting, and they need to, I think there needs to be a system in place that can protect these folks. All right, so the next thing that the new law covers is what's called a structural integrity reserve study. So I'm just gonna give you a real quick primer on what a reserve study is in general. Reserve study essentially looks at all of the common area elements of the building. What is a common area element? Well, for example, if you own a unit in a building, you own everything inside your unit. But the hallway and the stairs and the elevator that you took to walk into your unit is all owned by the condo association. So you're only like a part owner in that. That's called a common element. All right. And so what a reserve study does is it looks at all the common elements like the roof, the exterior of the building, the elevators, and it says, okay, this component should last this long, and you need to set aside this much money in order to cover the repair or replacement of that item. Well, in the past, what has happened is that associations could basically not do this. They could vote to waive funding any reserves or anything like that. And then you're left with associations that don't have any money to take care of these issues when they pop up. So the new law covers not only new requirements for funding reserve studies, but it also creates this new thing called a structural integrity reserve study, which in my opinion is probably just going to kill regular reserve studies in general. Because why would you, as an association, why would you hire one person to do a reserve study and one person to do a structural integrity reserve study when the firm that's doing the structural integrity reserve study is going to be fully capable of just doing the full thing and doing both and combining it as one study. All right, so this structural integrity reserve study must be done every 10 years, regardless of the age of your building. So every 10 years, you got to have this structural integrity reserve study done. I'm not going to get into developers and transitions and stuff like that, but just essentially think about it as it's a 10-year cycle. You better have this thing done. They define a structural integrity reserve study in this new law as a study of the reserve funds required for future major repairs and replacement of the common areas based on a visual inspection of the common areas. So again, this whole visual inspection is leaning back to what I've been talking about this whole video, that they allow discretion. They acknowledge that it is not exhaustive. You're only required to inspect what is visually and readily available to visually inspect. All right, the structural integrity reserve study must be performed by an engineer or architect. And then one of the things that this means basically, because this has never been a requirement for reserve studies. They've never required who could do a reserve study. Anybody could do a reserve study. My 10-year-old daughter could do your reserve study. It probably wouldn't be very accurate, but she could do it, according to the law. Well, according to the new law, this structural integrity reserve study must be done by an engineer and architect. So this is a big benefit now to the people, condos and people living there, to make sure that a qualified person presumably is doing this study. And that also means that boards and property managers can no longer do their own reserve studies. I have tons of clients where a generally kind of smart person on the board who knows how to open up Microsoft Excel will attempt to do their own reserve study, and the associations will follow it and they'll vote on it and they'll work with it. And it's really not appropriate because they're not really qualified to do an appropriate study. The other thing that they require in the structural integrity reserve study is a whole bunch of a list of things that now must be commented on, looked at, and assessed in this way. One of them is, I'll just go through the list. They want you to cover the roof, the load-bearing walls, other primary structural members, floors, the foundation, fireproofing and fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical, waterproofing and exterior painting, windows, and any other item with deferred maintenance cost exceeding $10,000. Deferred maintenance meaning repair or replacement. So there's going to be some interesting things. I've heard word that like some of these things might be removed or shifted over to some other kind of report. For example, the fireproofing and fire protection systems and the electrical systems. Most structural engineers and architects aren't qualified to inspect those items. So if we're required to do those as part of a structural integrity reserve study, my firm, for example, is qualified to look at aspects of those systems, but not exhaustively, or not maybe to the full extent that the intent of this law requires. So we may have to partner with some other firms to provide these services moving forward. We'll make that determination over the next few weeks. Another interesting thing is that all those items that I just listed, the main ones that we really care about are like load-bearing walls, roof, primary structural members, the floor, foundation, those major structural components, including waterproofing, painting, and windows. Okay, it says in the statute that these items cannot be waived or partially funded anymore. So an association still can waive or partially fund the other reserve components that may be like, ceiling fans in the hallway, maybe some pavers at your entryway, some landscaping. So you can waive funding those things, but you can't waive the things that are important to save people's lives. Understand? Which is the structure, the fire systems, the electrical systems. And I think the reason why the fire system is in this, from what I recall from Champlain Tower South, is that when the pool deck had partially collapsed well before the building had collapsed, I think there was a 7 or 8 minute window there, if I recall correctly. We can see that there was fire line pipes that had busted and were flowing and pumping water out in the garage. Yet in the videos that we see, we didn't hear any of the fire alarms going off. So I think that was part of the lawsuit settlement in the Champlain Tower South case, was the fact that these fire alarm system didn't really do what it was supposed to do. It didn't perform as intended. Just like the milestone inspection reports, the structural integrity reserve study must be completed by December 21st 2024. So again, you've got about 2.5 years to get this structural integrity reserve study done. And then every 10 years after, you're going to have to get it redone, or, you know, and most people will probably have it done much sooner than that. Reserve studies are usually done on a 3 to 5 year cycle. The laws also so that kind of concludes it for the structural integrity reserve study. The final thought I'll add is just some of the extra duties and requirements that they put onto association boards, condo association boards, because they realize and recognize, I think, in the Florida Senate and House that there's a psychology here with boards. Okay, you got 5 lay people running this building. These aren't engineers themselves. They're not contractors. They're typically lay people, and the board and the state finds it really important to make sure that these folks are bound by certain responsibilities. We refer to those as fiduciary responsibilities. And so one of the things that the new law establishes is that these milestone inspection reports and these structural integrity reserve studies are now part of the fiduciary responsibility of the board members. So they are legally required to make sure these things get done. It's very, very important. They also establish that the unit owners and renters, so people who don't have an ownership stake in the building but are renting there, like long-term rentals, they have a right to access and read the milestone inspection report. So really, it's ideal for most of these associations to just go ahead and post the milestone inspection report on their website so that anybody renting there, living there, or living around there can read these milestone inspection reports and understand the structural condition of the building. Milestone reports must be delivered to the unit owners. So not only do they have a right to access it, but the board now has a duty to make sure that the milestone inspection report that they get from their engineer or architect is actually delivered to the individual unit owner. So again, this is now part of law. And it doesn't matter what the report says. Even if the report says everything's wonderful, there's nothing wrong with your building, you're good for another 10 years, that report must be sent to those unit owners. However, the law does not state that it must be sent to renters. Renters only have a right to access or read the report, but the board is not obligated to send that report to renters. That's an interesting distinction to note. Unit owners that do not get that report, and they can't access the report. Maybe the board doesn't put it on the website, or one of the board members got it from the engineer, but they're refusing to send it on to the unit owners. A new interesting law is that, and I don't think it's actually a new law, I think it's kind of been there before, but they repeated it in this new statute, is that the unit owners can be awarded damages of $50 per day for every day that they can't access this report. And this can add up very quickly. You know, if you got a building with 200 people in it, and you don't give them access to the report, and it goes on a month or two, you could be looking at damages in the tens of thousands of dollars very quickly. Anyway, and then all of these reports, whether it's the milestone inspection report phase 1, the milestone inspection report phase 2, or the structural integrity reserve study, all of these reports must be maintained for 15 years. So this is going to create an interesting issue, because all records are supposed to be kept, but oftentimes they're not really kept that well. Over the course of 15 years, no way are the board members that were in place at the beginning are going to be the board members that are in place 15 years later. These members cycle out very quickly. The other thing too that's probably not going to be true 15 years later is you probably won't even have the same property management firm. You will probably be on 2 or 3 property management firms later. So keeping the records is one thing, but the question is who keeps them? How are records transferred from property manager to property manager, from old board to the next board? And that's something that these new property managers are going to have to start figuring out a better system to really make sure that these records are kept and maintained and transferred. A lot of, I mean, this is a common thing that's already been in the condo industry in Florida, this record keeping and passing along, but most of the records, let's just be honest, really weren't that important. Now we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about the structural integrity of the building, these milestone inspection reports, these structural integrity reports. These things are really important, and it's very important that they make sure that they get transferred on to the next party of interest. Well, I hope you learned something from this video, and if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. Thanks.